So let's go over kind of very high level first and show you the general layout, and then we'll go and look at each module in detail. So at a high level, you have your modulation section here. You have two different oscillators here. They get mixed into the mixer with a noise source or an external input in the back. And then once that's mixed, it gets run through a low pass filter, which you can control here. And then you have your amplifier, which you have a dedicated ADSR envelope for that. In the middle here, you have glide or portamento. And then at the bottom here, you have an LFO, a sequencer, an arpeggiator, and a bunch of different modes for how you trigger the keyboard. Incidentally, there's gate and CV ins and outs in the back, as well as a filter CV input. At the far right here, you have your master tune and the master volume. All right, so I've initialized the patch, super basic stuff. We have ADSR in kind of an organ shape where the sustain is all the way up, everything else is down. Filter all the way open, no resonance. I'm only mixing in Oscillator A. And let's go over Oscillator A while we're here. So this is what it sounds like right now. You may hear a bit of double triggering because it's an old synth and my keyboard here probably needs a bit of servicing, but this will do for now. You'll also hear a bit of reverb. I've added some Valhalla DSP on my computer just to make the sound a little easier on the ears as we explore. All right, so again, Oscillator A, we have simple controls. You have your global frequency here. And then you have octave control. So it goes from 0. Sorry for the keyboard triggers. 1, 2, up to 3. And then you have two waveforms. You have a sawtooth and a square or a pulse wave. And what's cool about this synth is that you can include as many waveforms as you want, and they all get mixed together. So just the sawtooth, just a square, or both together. Incidentally, the square wave has its own dedicated pulse width control here. And you can also turn sync on, which synchronizes or hard syncs Oscillator A to Oscillator B. So let's go back to sawtooth here. And Oscillator B is very similar. So if we go to our mixer here, I can lower Oscillator A and bring up Oscillator B. And I have it set to low mode now. So let me bring this back for now. So again, you have the same octave control, same frequency control, which is useful when you have hard sync on, because then you can tune the Oscillator B relative to A. And again, you have same waveforms, except here you also have a triangle wave in addition. And again, pulse width control or width control for the pulse width wave. And you can blend them all in if you want to. What's also cool about Oscillator B compared to A is that it can act as an LFO as well. So there's a dedicated LFO here, but you can turn B into an LFO, effectively giving you two LFOs by sacrificing one of the oscillators. And to do that, you just switch it to low frequency here. And then you can optionally turn it off so that it doesn't track the keyboard. So if you set this to off and this to low, you effectively get a free running LFO, which you can then assign to different parameters. And we'll cover that once we get to the modulation. But let's bring it back now so we can hear it. And I'm gonna lower B again and bring back A. Of course, you can mix the two together. And again, we can bring up some noise. Finally, we get to the filter, so let's play around with that a little bit. Let's do a classic sweep without any resonance. Beautiful sounding filter, super warm. Let me lower this again. I found that a really bassy sawtooth wave is kind of the best way to demonstrate a filter. Let's bring up the resonance a little bit. The filter is self-oscillating, and I find that the resonance knob is very sensitive. It really quickly goes into self-oscillation if you're not careful. And just like the Mini Moog, once you bring up the resonance, it lowers the volume of the filter, so you might need to compensate with the master volume. And right above 12 o'clock, we're getting self-oscillation already. So at this point, I can even turn off my oscillator and we still have a pitch coming from the filter. And in this case, you get a pure sine wave, which is cool for those kind of theremin style effects. Goes into really subby territory, which is also useful for making kick drums. All right, let's lower the resonance, bring back Oscillator 1. All right, let's play around with the filter controls here. So again, you have envelope amount and keyboard amount, and this just maps how the keyboard CV and the envelope CV gets mapped to the cutoff frequency of the filter. So let's play around with the keyboard amount just to demonstrate that. And this is a very typical feature where the higher you play on the keyboard, the more the filter opens up and the brighter the sound gets. And this is very typical of acoustic instruments as well. So it's a good way to imitate stuff like that. So right now I have it all the way off, so the filter is basically at the same level. And you can notice when I play really high on the frequency, the sound is almost inaudible because the cutoff frequency is independent of the pitch here. But as you go up in pitch, your overtones are so high that the filter completely wipes them out. And that's why it's useful to bring up some keyboard amount here. So let's play with that. Now you can hear the filter start to open slowly. So now up here, the cutoff frequency is much higher than down here. So here we're still getting that same very muffled sound, but as you go up, it opens up the filter. Get these nice vocally sounds. So that's it for keyboard amount. And next we have envelope amount. So again, the filter has its own dedicated ADSR envelope for controlling the cutoff frequency. And the amount by which this controls the cutoff frequency is determined by the envelope amount here. So let's bring that up. Right now the effect is instant because I have attack, decay, release down, and sustain up. So we can make it more into a brassy patch by decreasing the attack here, or increasing the attack depending on how you want to think of it. So we're getting more of a brassy kind of. And we can increase the release as well. And in this case, we'll have to increase the amplifier release as well. Bring the sustain down and bring the decay up and create more of a plucky. So that covers the filter pretty much. And while we're here, we can demonstrate the amplifier envelope as well, which is very similar. Again, we can make a pad sound by increasing the attack and release. Get these, maybe bring the pitch up. Bring up some noise. And then in the middle here, we have portamento or glide. So if I bring that up, it's just gonna slew the notes together. or I can turn auto on, which if I play kind of staccato, we get no glide. If I play legato, then we get glide. So that's cool for kind of performing lines. So let's turn that off for now. And finally, we get to the bottom here, which has our sequencer, arpeggiator, a bunch of trigger modes, and then the LFO. So I'll go back to the LFO once we get to the modulation section. Let's quickly demonstrate the arpeggiator and the sequencer, which are both clocked by the LFO here. So let me turn the arpeggiator on by flicking it up. So the three options are up, off, or up, down. So if I set it to up, we can just hold some notes down. And then the LFO is the clock rate. And if you want to lock the notes down while holding notes down, just push the sequencer to record while the arpeggiator is on. And let's go to up, down. Let's move over to the sequencer here. So the sequencer, you have 40 different steps, and it's very much like the SH101 if you're familiar with that one. So it's not a real-time sequencer, it just has 40 steps where you can insert notes or rests. You flick record on, you play some notes, and you flick play, and that you're good to go. Pretty simple stuff. There's two different sequencer slots. And the way it works is that you have a record and play switch, and then you have a sequencer 1 off and sequencer 2 switch. So first you flick the record play into record mode, and then as soon as you flick into one of the sequencer slots, it'll start recording or wait for you to input notes. If you're gonna play, go to off and then play it. All right, so we have three different modes here to choose from, and there's a gate LED which tells you whenever the gate is being fired. All right, so the first, you have a choice between retrig and normal. So if you set it to normal, it'll be low note priority. So if you play more than one note at a time, the low note will always take over because it has to choose one note because this is a mono synth. If you set retrig, it'll retrigger every time a new note is hit, effectively giving you last note priority. Next to that, you have normal or repeat external. So if you set it to normal, you get normal keyboard gate firing. If you set it to repeat/external, if you have something patched into the external gate input, it'll use that to trigger. And this is how you can use this to play like if you have a MIDI to CV converter, you would switch that on here. And if you don't have anything patched in the back, then repeat will just fire gates at the frequency of the LFO here. So if I can flick that on here. So this is a good way if you want just a steady pulse to play on. So pretty cool. And finally, you have the ability to turn droning on, which just puts the gate high all the time without having to press a key. So the drone switch is useful if you want to create a drone patch, or if you just want to enable it on if you're plugging something to the external audio input, for example. And finally, the last two knobs, like I said before, are master, tune, and volume. So that covers everything on this side of the synth. Finally, let's get into the modulation matrix, which is this little grid on the left here. So you have your modulation sources on the left and modulation destinations on the right. So you have three different modulation sources. So you have the filter envelope, which is this guy here. You have Oscillator B, which again can act as an LFO. And then you have the LFO, the dedicated one. So effectively you can have two LFOs if you switch B to LFO mode. And then for each one you set the amount with the knob. And then you choose whether it gets routed directly to the modulation destination or through the mod wheel. And then the mod wheel acts as a potentiometer, effectively controlling the amount of modulation globally for those routings. And then for your destinations, you have the frequency of oscillator A and B. You have the pulse width of oscillator A and B. And then you have the filter cutoff. All right, so let's do a classic example. Let's assign the LFO to the cutoff frequency of the filter. So in the LFO destination, I'm gonna set the amount to 12 o'clock, set the routing to wheel so that I can use my mod wheel to control the amount. And then for my destination, I'm gonna flick the filter destination here to the wheel as well. So now if I bring up the mod wheel, you can see that the LFO is controlling the cutoff frequency. Right now I have it a square wave, but I can switch it to a triangle or a sawtooth or a mixture of them. So you get these interesting new shapes. Fastest rate. Slowest. And then the rest of the modulation is very similar. So for example, if we flicked Oscillator B into LFO mode, so I set a low frequency and I turn off keyboard tracking, let me bring it down in pitch. So now I can effectively assign another LFO using Oscillator B also to the cutoff frequency of the filter. So we can have two different LFOs. So one I'm gonna set as a triangle, Oscillator B, and the LFO I'll set as a square wave. So you're gonna see kind of two different LFO shapes at different rates, which will give you these interesting rhythmic effects. So let me bring it up that amount here. So we get these kind of really complex LFO shapes. So that's some basic examples there. The other example that's pretty common is vibrato. So vibrato is a change of pitch over time. So I'm gonna turn off these ones here. I'm just gonna use the basic LFO, set it to wheel mode. I'm gonna turn off the destination of the filter here. So I'm just gonna set it to control the frequency of oscillator A, and then we're just gonna fine tune it until we find a good vibrato spot. Set this to triangle. So now we can just play and add some vibrato with the mod wheel. You can also use this LFO modulation of the frequency. If you set it at a slow rate with a subtle amount, you'll get that kind of slight pitch shift, which is common in kind of the Boards of Canada type sounds. All right, so that wraps up the overview of the Pro One. Super lovely synth, huge sounds. Whenever I need like earthquake shaking type of sounds, this is definitely always the go-to. Super warm, really nice synth. My keyboard definitely needs some work here, like kind of double triggers, but it works fine if I MIDI to CV it, so it's good for tracking sounds and kind of adding that huge vintagey warmth to your tracks. So yeah, lovely little synth. I'll definitely try to do more kind of just pure sound demos of this, but hopefully this was interesting in the meantime. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next.